Back to the phones. Ron in Corona Del Mar, California, on our line for Republicans. Go ahead, Ron.
Hey, Rob, how you doing? Listen, Colonel Leighton, you're talking to a Spec 4 Army, so I want you to understand where this is coming from.
Sure.
And number one is that where are the witnesses? Where's the cell phone evidence of these 16 dead people? Okay, we want to see what's going on here as well as the president does. He needs corroboration, and he needs verification, and there's no reason to go in there and do a bunch of stuff. Hey, we can't even look at it when Saddam Hussein, as you mentioned, Chemical Ali went into and gassed the Kurds. They had pictures, they had lots of eyewitnesses to tell the tale. There are no eyewitnesses that we can find. We don't have a specific leader. We don't have a Subcomandante Marcos leader person who is in Syria right now that we can go to. We need to find that leader that will go into a third-party country and discuss the evidence that's at hand.
That's an excellent point, and by the way, thank you for your service. Love the Army. My dad was in the Army for 20 years, so I definitely appreciate all that you did and know a lot about it. Ron, that is an excellent point. The as far as specific evidence, a lot of that is, as you know, going to be classified when it comes to these 15 or 16 people were specifically killed in this particular way, and a lot of that depends on, quite frankly, pathological evidence, human tissue samples, blood samples, things like that. So that may be very hard to get because of access issues with Syria. As far as a Subcomandante Marcos type personality within the Free Syrian Army, you're pointing to an issue that is really indicative of the difficulty in Syria, because the Free Syrian Army has a leadership problem. At least externally, we find it very difficult to hang our hat on a particular individual, and not that we would want to necessarily, but because of the way that organization is structured or not structured, there are very few folks where we can say, okay, this is the one that we would go to, and we have to be very careful with that, because our experience, as you know, with a lot of folks in countries like this has not been, let's say 100%, not been that good.
Earlier this week, House Intelligence Committee ranking member Dutch Ruppersberger talked about the House briefing on Syria and action going forward. This is what he had to say.
We feel that there has been some chemical weapons that have been used, but we're still investigating who did it, where it's coming from, and right now we're just in an evaluation stage. One of the most important issues is that we do bring together the other countries. We need to work as a team.
That was House Intelligence Committee ranking member Dutch Ruppersberger. Also, we've got this tweet from Jan Ness, who says, sir, what makes anyone think we'd believe any intelligence, in quotes, coming from the Pentagon anymore?
Well, that is one of those things where intelligence always has a difficult time proving things that are there. It's an issue of access. It's an issue of not only access and gathering the information, but also analyzing the information that is out there. The parts that you don't see are generally very successful. The intelligence apparatus does very well in terms of informing people for very specific things. For example, it's very good when it comes to specific military engagements. Where it is less good and less able to work through things is when we're dealing with nuance, when we're dealing with trying to determine intent, where we're trying to find who is doing what to whom and what the causal effects are and what the motivations are. That has always been a very difficult thing, because sometimes, quite frankly, we don't know ourselves what we're going to do next. And if you're trying to figure that out for another person, let alone another person in another culture, that is a significant difficulty just because of the nature of human beings. But it is also a difficulty based on how we can assess things in our understanding of places around the world. The intelligence that we have is generally very good. Unfortunately, you usually don't see the successes, but you will certainly know about the failures, and that is why the intelligence community always has a very interesting time explaining itself in public.
Our next call for Colonel Cedric Leighton comes from Tom in Perth Amboy, New Jersey, on our line for independence. Go ahead, Tom.
Good morning, gentlemen. I want to just specify some terms here. When you use the term national security or national interest, to my way of thinking, that always encompasses the military, industrial, intelligence, corporate complex, but sometimes encompasses the interests of the American people. To my way of thinking, they're more interested in education and Meals on Wheels and Head Start and the social programs that take the hit. Why don't you prove that you're not just part of a psychological operation conditioning us and making us afraid and being fearful of Syrians' use of chemical weapons by detailing your knowledge of the use of United States chemical weapons in the various wars of the past, like, for example, Agent Orange in Vietnam and CIA bio experiments in Florida and LSD released in New York City subways. Why don't you talk about that, sir, and establish your credibility as an independent commentator?
Tom, what would be the purpose of the Colonel coming on and making people afraid of what's going on in Syria?
It conditions us to get ready for another war, Rob. It conditions us to have enemies and fight against other people in other parts of the world that we have no essential interest in fighting or killing. And like chemical weapons are so bad. How about killing people with regular bullets? That's awful too.
Tom in Perth Amboy, New Jersey. Colonel Leighton.
Well, Tom, here's the way I look at it. You know, you mentioned Agent Orange and LSD experiments that were done by the CIA in the past. You know, luckily before my time, and quite frankly, if I had any inkling that anything like that was going on when I was in the military, I would have resigned. So, you know, there are different times, different rules, different places that, you know, these things did occur, but the current situation is a much different situation when it comes to that. I do not personally approve of the use of Agent Orange. I do not approve of LSD or other drug experiments on human subjects, and I stand by that and would always stand by that. Now, in terms of Syria, you know, there are certain things that are key elements here. I am not a part of the so-called military-industrial complex. What I do is I provide independent advice in my current capacity as an independent consultant. I do not work directly with defense contractors, and I do not do things on behalf of the U.S. military at this point, although I did enjoy my service, and I think it was a noble calling. In this particular situation, what you're looking at here is understanding what the world is all about. And in order to secure things, such as the social programs that you spoke about, you need to have a means of doing so. And the national security apparatus that the United States has is designed to do that, to provide that security so that people can enjoy the benefits of living in this country. And that is really what this is all about. And in terms of, you know, what happens next in places like Syria, it is only through a dialogue that is done in front of the American people that we can achieve a consensus as to what to do next. The national security complex that you talk about is paid for by the American people, and it is an employee, in essence, of the American people. All of us who have sworn an oath to support the Constitution when we do serve in the military are responsible to the American people and to the Constitution for our conduct. And that is something that remains inviolate, and you know, we try our best as institutions that are there to make that work for us. So that is really what this is all about. We try to make this work for the American people on behalf of the American people.
In the New York Times this morning, the jump page shows President Obama avoids swift response to chemical weapons report. Shows a picture of the president meeting with King Abdullah of Jordan at the White House on Friday. An administration official said the two discussed coordinating more robust aid for the opposition in Syria. We want to show you what the president had to say during this meeting with Jordan's King Abdullah, and then we'll get a response from Colonel Cedric Leighton.
Knowing that potentially chemical weapons have been used inside of Syria doesn't tell us when they were used, how they were used. Obtaining confirmation and strong evidence, all of those things we have to make sure that we work on with the international community, and we ourselves are going to be putting a lot of resources into focusing on this. I think that in many ways, a line's been crossed when we see tens of thousands of innocent people being killed by a regime. but the use of chemical weapons and the dangers that poses to the international community, to neighbors of Syria, the potential for chemical weapons to get into the hands of terrorists, all of those things add increased urgency to what is already a significant security problem and humanitarian problem in the region.
Colonel Leighton, in addition to the Jordanians, who are some of the other allies that the U.S. can look to in trying to resolve this situation without necessarily having to put U.S. troops on the ground?
Well, there are several, and the Jordanians are, of course, a prime example, but you're looking at Turkey, which shares a northern border with Syria, and, oh, by the way, is a member of NATO. And because of that connection, the Turkish government is very interested in what is happening in Syria and sees it as a national security issue for that country. The other thing to know about Turkey, as with Jordan, is that they have a significant Syrian refugee problem. And each of these countries has a significant stake in resolving the conflict for maybe not just that reason, but it's a key reason of preventing a refugee exodus into their countries, because that would affect their fragile economies. Then you also have Saudi Arabia, and you have Qatar, you have the United Arab Emirates. All of these countries have diplomatic reasons. The Qataris and the Saudis are particularly active in arming the Free Syrian Army. They are keenly interested in essence, getting rid of Assad because of his Iranian connection, and anything that they can do to minimize Iranian influence in the Arab world is something that is in their national interests. So those are some key allies in this part of the world. But when you expand that into Europe, you have the French and the British, who also have both historical and economic interests in the Middle East, and they look at the Syrian situation as being detrimental to their national interests, their economic interests, and also, quite frankly, their humanitarian interests.
You mentioned arming the Free Syrian Army, and Joseph Ramirez sends us this tweet and wants to know, any chance we are better off with the devil we know having the chemical weapons than the devil we don't know?
Well, there is a chance, and that's actually an excellent question, and that's where you have to make a decision when you're working a policy issue like this. The Assad regime is, quite frankly, a very brutal regime. They are, key proponents of the use of torture. They do that, as we can see, on their own people. They do that to their political opponents. They also harbor groups that are opposed to Israel, and so they are not a good actor, not to mention, of course, the Iranian piece. But the other side of that is, if, as the current events indicate, the Free Syrian Army, let's say they take over Syria at this point, what happens next? Well, the problem is we don't really know who they are. We do know some elements of them. We do know that there are some elements that are in favor of a more secular approach to problems of the Middle East. The problem with that is any party of the center politically is going to have a very difficult time getting popular support and, quite frankly, having the charismatic leaders that are necessary to take a country like Syria from a broken state, which it is in now, into a future that would be viable for that country. Syria has so many diverse ethnicities within it, so many diverse religious groupings within it, that it becomes very hard to see how one can glue that all back together absent a Ba'athist regime like the Assad regime. That is not to say that I'm in favor of Assad at all. I'm not. But those are the types of things that one has to consider. And in this case, the devil that you know is at least somebody that you have some understanding of. The devil that you don't know is one that you have to establish that understanding of. And that's the difficult part right now.
We're talking with Colonel Cedric Leighton, U.S. Air Force retired, former military intelligence officer, and former deputy director of the National Security Agency. Our next call comes from Joe in Ash, North Carolina, on our line for Republicans. Joe, thanks for waiting.
Yes, good morning, Colonel.
Good morning.
History you always have to learn from history, and either from the Hittites, the Persians, the Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, everybody has been killing themselves. Even when, during the First World War, the British came in and pushed the Ottoman Empire apart, which is Turkey now, they still killed each other. And then the British took it over, and the French took it over, and they got their bottoms thrown out. You must leave these people alone till they come to the fact that they will not kill each other. Europe did the same thing. They used to attack each other, kill each other. They quit when they realized it was a non sequitur. They can't win.
Joe in Ash, North Carolina. JJJ Jr. also has this tweet along the similar line. He wants to know, he says rather, Obama created the turmoil and the civil war when he stated that Assad must go several years ago, which caused the power struggle.
Well, I don't think it caused the power struggle, but I think it may have inadvertently added some fuel to the fire. The power struggle was going to happen whether there was the United States or not. The key thing about Joe's history piece there is it's very interesting because you know, that is absolutely true. These folks have been killing each other for thousands of years. The problem that you have if you try to impose a European model on this or get them to realize that there's a European model out there, they know that intellectually, but in their hearts it's a different issue. When it comes to the European model, the reason that the Europeans aren't fighting each other like they did you know, for thousands of years before 1945 is that the United States stepped in and provided the Europeans with a framework, namely the Marshall Plan, so that they could have the economic development that they needed to get to the place that they had been before the Second World War. And then from there, they developed the institutions that now are known as the European Union. And that kind of union has been a goal of many Arab movements. Gamal Abdel Nasser, for example, in Egypt. In fact, Syria and Egypt were one country at one point, known as the United Arab Republic back in the 60s. That was a fairly short-lived experiment, but the philosophy of Pan-Arabism is an Arab version of, in essence, establishing a unified state for all Arabic peoples. The problem with that is it's not a reality. And until something like that becomes a reality, and the basis for it is a peaceful basis, it is based on mutual understanding, mutual cooperation, and less on an ethnic tension that exists in so many, or sectarian tension that exists in so many of these countries, you are not going to find that kind of a framework being established in the Arab world. And it's regrettable, but unfortunately, until they get to that point, the killing will continue. And unfortunately, them getting to that point is, in my view, unfortunately, a long way off.
Congressman Adam Smith, Democrat of Washington, the top Democrat on the House Armed Services Committee, is our guest this weekend on Newsmakers. During his conversation, he discussed how the House and Senate approach towards Syria seemed to differ. This is what he had to say.
I think on the House side, we've been more cautious about the notion of, yes, it's a horrible situation, what can we do about it? You know, we are not in a position to simply go in there and fix the problem. A lesson that we learned in Iraq, we've learned in Afghanistan. U.S. military might alone does not automatically solve and make peaceful a situation. So there's a limitation on what we can do. I think the U.S. has been involved in providing humanitarian aid, in working with Jordan and other partners in the region to figure out, you know, what we can do to help, like you said, the legitimate rebels. But that's the tough question. We don't want to be arming Al-Qaeda. We don't want to be creating a more violent and more difficult situation. I think there is openness on the House to potentially working with partner nations to arm the right set of rebels, but figuring out who those are remains elusive. So I think it is a more cautious approach in the House. And I'll also say, for all of the rhetoric out of the Senate, when it comes down to specifics, what should we do? You talk about a no-fly zone. The implications of doing a no-fly zone in Syria are just overwhelming. The military that we would have to commit, the losses that we would sustain, the war that we would be engaged in doing that is really pretty extensive.
Representative Adam Smith is our guest on Newsmakers this weekend. You can see the entire interview on Sunday morning at 10 a.m. and again on 6 p.m. on C-SPAN. It's also available online at cspan.org. To that, I want to add this tweet from Freelancer who says, "Note to the GOP, we are not going to war over imaginary WMD again. If Senator McCain and others want to fight, let them." Colonel Leighton.
Well, obviously, if we're going to fight as a unified nation, and that's going to be the key thing. We are not in a position right now where there is unity between not only Republicans and Democrats, but as you saw with Congressman Smith, the House and Senate have different approaches, and there are elements, obviously, in the Senate, like Senator McCain, as Freelancer mentioned, that seem to be very much in favor of establishing a no-fly zone. I'll take a little bit of issue with Congressman Smith's comment about establishing a no-fly zone, having been involved in doing that in Iraq. The no-fly zones are not, they are somewhat difficult to establish, but they're not impossible to establish. The question is, does it make sense from an Air Force perspective? You know, are you going to actually keep planes on the ground? Is it going to cover the entire nation, or is it going to cover sectors of that nation? And will it be effective as far as the people that we're trying to help are concerned, that is the civilian population in Syria? So there are a lot of different things that are out there, a lot of factors to consider, but it's not impossible to do. You just have to have the intelligence and the willingness to make that happen.
Our next call for Colonel Leighton comes from Maria in North Fort Myers, Florida, on our line for Democrats. Go ahead.
Yes, good morning.
Good morning, Maria.
Yes, I've been listening to everybody's opinion. I know it's only gentlemen men speaking, so I think you need a female too. Yeah, I was listening to one opinion with one gentleman. He said the issue about the chemical weapons in Syria.
Maria, you still with us?
Yes, and
go ahead and finish your thought.
The United Nations should get involved, and because it's not only a U.S. responsibility, because this is, I think, it's a worldwide problem now.
I would not disagree with that. In fact, the United Nations was established to handle these kinds of events, to handle the kind of fighting that you see in Syria, to handle issues like Rwanda was in the 1990s. That is the job of the UN, quite frankly. The problem is that the UN hasn't stepped up to the plate, to borrow a baseball metaphor, because there are so many factors and so many vested interests that are in play at the UN. And unfortunately, many member nations in the UN use the UN to leverage their power plays and to establish a means of power projection, at least in the diplomatic sense. So that's the kind of stuff that has to be worked through. And if you want to make the UN more effective, that's the kind of stuff that has to be put on the sideline if the UN is going to do what it was intended to do.
We've been talking about the use of chemical weapons in Syria with Colonel Cedric Leighton, former military intelligence officer in the U.S. Air Force and former deputy director of the National Security Agency. Sir, thank you very much for being on the program.
My pleasure, Rob. Thanks for having me.